Welcome. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Morena team, hey, 23rd of December if you're picking this up when it drops, which is super exciting. Even if you're not a big fan of Christmas, I think we all can appreciate that, we've only got like 7 or 8 more sleeps until 2021 and we can say goodbye to 2020. Fingers crossed for a better year. Although, to be fair, I think most people probably said that about the end of 2019. Anyway, I digress. Today on the show, I have my mate, Dr. Eric Helms, and I'm so excited to talk to Eric today. So, for those of you who don't know Eric is in the science of drug-free bodybuilding and powerlifting, and he is a science communicator. He coaches natural athletes as part of Team 3D Muscle Journey and publishes peer-reviewed academic articles and blogs about physique and strength sport. He speaks at academic and commercial conferences, appears on fitness, nutrition, and exercise science podcasts like this one, and is active on social media. Very active. I pick up heaps of tips from Eric when I follow him on Instagram. So he's a PhD in strength and conditioning with a research focus on auto-regulating powerlifting training. His research focus for his second master's, because one was not enough, was on protein and macronutrient manipulation for dieting bodybuilders. And he did his first master's in exercise science and health promotion with a concentration on performance enhancement and injury prevention. Eric is currently a research fellow at the Sports Performance Research Institute, New Zealand, at Auckland University of Technology. And as an athlete, he competes in strength and physique sport, and he has earned pro status as a natural bodybuilder with the PNBA in 2011 and competes in the IPF as an unequipped powerlifter. Eric is such a wealth of information with anything related to dieting, physique science, protein, strength and conditioning, and you do not need to be a bikini model or a bodybuilder to really benefit from a lot of the take-homes that Eric has. He's so good at translating that science into practice, really, for anyone who is interested in improving body composition. So today on the podcast, you'll see that we talk around a whole host of issues in and around dieting, around training, and around, some of the real kind of key things that Eric has learned over the years. So without further ado, you can enjoy this conversation that I had with Eric Helms. Awesome. Dr. Eric Helms, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. It's great to talk to you, Mikki.
Oh, do you know what? I was you were very gracious in allowing me the additional 5 minutes to go and grab a coffee. I've been on client calls this morning and I was thinking, well, one, I'm a bit devastated because it is an instant coffee because I've run out of my all-press plunger. And then worst of all is that it's terrible instant coffee. It's some kind of dark roast Moccona, which I only usually go for level 5 of Moccona, and someone bought the wrong one. Because it has been a while since I've indulged in, well, I don't think indulged in instant coffee. I've been kind of reduced to instant coffee is probably a better way to describe it.
That's probably a better way of describing it for sure.
Yeah. And then there's no milk. And so I've got almond milk in there, which will curdle instantly upon adding to that hot water. So, but it has the caffeine.
That's all you got. And honestly, I'm sorry having such a rough morning. I'm right there with you because before this I was on our monthly audio roundtable for mass that we do for our research review. Didn't have time to put the kettle on, even with the 5 minutes you gave me before we started. So I'm just running on Pepsi Max. So.
Mate, I used to be so addicted to Pepsi Max. I don't know if you remember the Pepsi Max bullet that used to. Okay, so this is it was awesome for someone like me. I would have one every lunchtime with my chicken salad. And the bullet is the size of a 600 ml. but
Oh,
it's
yes.
better. It is a litre of Pepsi Max. It was $2 from the dairy, and I used to down one of them every lunch and love it.
And that's for a liter, that's a substantial amount of caffeine. Because I want to say like the 355 mil is like 36 milligrams of caffeine or something like that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's
That's
got a
enough,
little bit.
eh?
It's got
Yeah.
a small amount.
And you would be probably quite well brushed up on caffeine, I assume, because the latest podcast of Iron Culture that I listened to was all about caffeine.
Yes, we had my good friend Ben Esgro, who's got a lot of experience in the whole supplement world. He's been at the helm of De Novo Nutrition. He's got a master's degree in sports nutrition. He's an RD, and
Yeah.
he's also recently, well, I guess less recently now, completed a second master's in I think it's pharmacological chemistry or something like that. But it's like actual science, not like
Yeah.
what I do. So
Oh, mate, and what I did, which was like put fruit bowls in workplaces. And what do you know? People eat more fruit. Boom. Here's your PhD, Dr. Mikki Williden. Thank you.
Dr. Williden, it's important because I only needed the math skills to count to 10 for my PhD. So nothing wrong with that. Yeah.
What I will say, like, hilariously, actually, you and Omar made me laugh. You do, or like quite frequently, but particularly when you were like, Ben, mate, it's close to 1 o'clock. We've kept you up, but please run me through those biochemical pathways of caffeine just one more time.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge that we're using you and apologize, but we're still going to use you is
Yeah,
essentially how that went.
exactly.
Yeah.
Eric, there are so many things that we could discuss today in my head because you are, it's such a wealth of information. You are one of these rare people who have two masters and a PhD because one clearly wasn't enough. The fact that you just told me Ben had a master's as well makes me think it's just what you crazy cats do. And maybe I missed out somewhere along the way. Probably just wasn't smart enough to bother doing it. But even with our beverages that we are drinking today is kind of highlights to me some of the differences that you and I might have had on diet philosophies, but just how my thinking has changed a little bit over the last couple of years around dieting, around flexible dieting, what it means. And I suppose some of the benefits of not being quite the zealot that I once was. And I figured one of the best people to talk to about that is, of course, Dr. Eric Helms, who wealth of information, all things strength conditioning, diet, protein, caffeine. What else are you a master of, Eric?
Oh, well, I think the whole idea that I'm super smart and so I have all these masters is probably better described by a lack of a life and a singular focus on lifting weights and being obsessive. But so yeah, people sometimes describe me kind of as you did as like, oh, you're an S&C guy or you're a nutrition guy or you're both. I think I've always been very, very tuned into the bodybuilding and strength sport community. And that crosses a lot of Venn diagrams, but it is, in my opinion, quite specialized. So I like to describe myself as a strength and physique sports scientist.
Nice.
Because if we get into like clinical nutrition, all of a sudden I sound far less knowledgeable. Or if we get into like S&C for sports that are outside of being strength dominant, same thing. Like I've never written a plyometrics program in my life, yet I have CSCS. So that it is a little misleading. So
No, I appreciate that, but do you know what I think about physique nutrition and physique fitness, and I think you've described this before as well, is that we are looking at people in this extreme environment, and you were looking at people pushing the limits of what they can do on both the diet and the training front, but it absolutely has application to your kind of standard general population who are kind of just a toned down version of what you'd see up there on stage, or what they want to achieve out of their nutrition and their training. And
I don't disagree with that. So
yeah, and the more that I like think about body composition and from both a training, but more so obviously from a nutrition perspective, there are so many lessons that you can learn from that physique science and the physique fitness, and it feels like science is constantly catching up on where the practice has been for like multiple years now, particularly in the space of diet, body composition, and things like that.
Yep. Like if you like one example, for example, is where there's been a lot of research on having a casein shake before bed to have like a slow digesting
Yes.
protein thing. I remember reading about that like the first month I started in the bodybuilding community. That was
Yeah.
something that was postulated long before it ever entered, the hallowed halls of peer-reviewed literature.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're not wrong.
Yeah. So, Eric, like some of the questions I ask you today will probably, or our discussion points will be pretty rudimentary for someone like you, and probably people who follow you, and you have a mass kind of following, obviously. But for people who I might kind of engage with on a day-to-day basis, they're probably fairly new concepts, or
Mm.
they may have heard about them and don't quite understand them, and things like that. So, can I even just begin us off by asking, what is this concept of flexible dieting? Kind of where does it sit in the realm of how people eat? And just preface it with this idea that I'm quite known for being a low carb advocate, eating more minimally processed. 5 years ago, I would have said I was an advocate for paleo, but you can't say that anymore. So, and actually, I've changed my thinking in and around diet and come back to this kind of middle ground. Yeah, explain to me what flexible dieting is.
Yeah, I like how well, for one, I think you find someone who hasn't changed their opinion, who's supposedly an academic over multiple years, and I would challenge that they're actually an academic, that it doesn't sound
Yeah.
like someone who is following the tenets of rational skepticism or empirical inquiry. It sounds like someone who's really good at confirming their biases. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
Um, and I would also like to say, like, I've changed my opinion a lot. You mentioned how you started with certain paradigms, shifted one way, shifted back, and eventually came to where you are now. And it sounds like you're acknowledging, hey, and it may not be this way 5 years from now. Um, I got into sports science in 2012, to do my MPhil. First time I was really engaging with doing empirical research 8 years after I'd been in the bodybuilding scene. So my views have changed a lot. And one of the things that I have tried to do is to merge what we know of as flexible dieting, if you actually read the research, with what flexible dieting has meant in practice, because they are similar, but they're quite different and in some very important ways. So while you frame this question as, hey, this is just the basics we need to know, it's actually a relatively nuanced answer. And I'll try to be concise with it. So if we start with the research perspective, flexible dieting is closest to a term known as flexible restraint. And back in the 90s, there was a researcher group led by Weston Hoffer. And what they did is they took a really well-known eating scale that one of the subscales is restraint. And they said, you know what, there seems to be two different types of restrainers. And they modified the scale so that they could get scores for flexible restraint and rigid restraint, or rigid dietary control or flexible control. You might see both terms. And they found that very divergent outcomes were predicted by whether or not you might be a flexible or rigid restrainer, even with a similar restraint score. And it led to this kind of line of research that said, hey, restraint is not the problem. And that's probably why we saw some, divergent findings, with higher levels of restraint being good or bad, quote unquote. It's how you restrain. So flexible restraint is typified by people who don't view diets or being on or off a diet in dichotomous terms.
Yeah.
So someone who is following or the flexible restraint mentality in relationship with food kind of understands that, if they went off the diet at lunch, it's not just screw it, I might as well have a pizza, and they don't see it as, let's go hard and fast, it's all in,
Yeah.
let's do it, and if I mess up, it's a problem. So rigid restraint is these very black and white views. It's typically adding a moral element to food, like food is either good or bad.
Yeah.
At the time, orthorexia was not a term, but I think it would share a lot of those terms, what we would describe as orthorexia today.
Yeah.
Having kind of a moral judgment of what foods are in people based on what they eat, and most importantly, yourself, which is where I think most of the harm comes. So really, really briefly, a lot of the associations they found were that BMI scores were higher in people who are rigid restrainers.
Yeah.
Weight loss maintenance was poorer. Eating disorders were higher. And in general, stress levels were higher. And then they extended this to longitudinal research where if they could shift someone more at the beginning from being a rigid to a more flexible restraint person, that predicted 1 and I think 3-year weight loss maintenance. So that's the research.
Yeah. And bearing in mind what I was saying with regards to kind of the paleo thing and stuff, it sounds to me like quote unquote paleo, keto, carnivore, these will be, I suppose, ways of eating that would fit into that kind of rigid restrain type model, right? Because it's about the rules, regardless of what those rules are, you're sticking to these rules, that moral element, like, you know, and that kind of almost, I'm more virtuous because I'm, you know, paleo, or I'm, dare I say it, vegan, or, you know, something like that. And then, of course, I'm just thinking about from a client perspective, people who say that they're paleo, but then they go and have, say, a quote unquote cheat meal or go off. They're just going to binge basically because, and I'm being very generalist here, but you know, you'd often see that kind of behavior because those rules are so unsustainable, but that's only what they know. It's when they kind of go off, they go off big time.
Yep.
It's interesting that the research shows that association as well with people who have eating disorders, because it's not that rigid restraint, I would say, would cause an eating disorder, but it follows that someone who may have a predisposition to that disordered eating process are drawn to a type of behavior which sets them up these quite clear boundaries. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. That's an important thing is a lot of the Westenhofer and subsequent research was correlational in nature. So that the directionality is difficult. So for example, being a physique sports scientist, we see much higher rates of eating disorders among physique competitors, which, you know, makes sense if you think about having to get that lean and having to follow a diet that almost must be rigid at some point, even if, which we'll get to, even if you follow a quote unquote like colloquial flexible diet where there's no restriction on what food you can eat per se, you're just hitting certain targets for calories or macronutrients. When you have so little wiggle room with those numbers, it becomes rigid because very few things fit.
Yeah.
But those relationships or those higher rates, I should say, of disordered eating and body image issues in physique competitors, we can't just say that physique sport causes that, because it is equally as possible that people with those relationships with food and their body are drawn towards physique sport. And it's not necessarily just the chicken or egg. It's probably a little bit of both. And more importantly, how do you cook your eggs and how do you raise your chickens? It's it's because like you were saying, you could advocate paleo in a much less dogmatic way. It's just that's not the typical cultural meme we see. Typically, it's that person who just started CrossFit last week who thinks that no matter what your athletic goal is or your fitness goal, CrossFit is your one true Lord and Savior. And by the way, that comes with, we have to fight the evil food engineering companies that are destroying the moral fabric of society. And you can literally find, if you go into some CrossFits, and I've seen it in multiple ones, they have this poster and it's basically what you should or shouldn't eat. And on the left, they have like the silhouette of like a nuclear plant.
Oh no.
And it has the nuclear symbol on the plant, and it says like big food or like, so it's this idea that there's this agricorp mega company that is equivalent to nuclear power in terms of its potential, damage or like it's radioactive waste you're eating or something like that. And then on the other side, it's basically paleo. But if someone was to come across and say, you know what, the data would support and it makes sense in terms of satiety signaling and, like ad libitum food consumption to consume, mostly single ingredient food items, minimally processed foods, to prepare your own meals and to minimize the number of things that have been pre-processed. Very few people would argue with that. Like, totally, but that sort of is paleo. Yeah. Because paleo wasn't designed by anthropologists. It's not 100% in line with what like Homo erectus ate, or anything like that.
Yeah.
So essentially what they're saying is eat quote unquote real food. And I don't know many nutrition advocates that if you had them speak outside of some of the quantitative stuff and more qualitatively describe the diet, it would look like that.
Yeah.
So if we can agree that that is kind of what most good diets, quote unquote, look like, especially for public health, maybe not performance in some cases,
Yeah.
then it's just a matter of how do you package it. And if you package it with dogma, again, both can be restraint, but one can be rigid restraint. So I think that dogma does more harm than people realize, because they get these moralistic relationships. And I didn't come from like a keto or a paleo background, but I did come from a hardcore bodybuilding background. And the standard like approach to especially contest prep is you got like 8 foods to play with. You know, you've got chicken, you've got lean fish, you get like tuna and chicken is 90%, maybe some egg whites. And then you've got brown rice or kumara as your carb source. Oats as well. That always makes the list for some reason. And then you've got like fish oil, avocado, nuts, and nut butters. And that is it, you know? So that is, of course, broccoli and all the fibrous vegetables you want.
Yeah.
So like that is no less harmful, even though it's a different paradigm. And I think moving away from that is the impetus for flexible dieting.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, you've been in it for a number of years now, Eric. Do you still see that old school type approach to the diet in the gyms and with people that you talk to and clients that you take on board and stuff? Is this still the kind of dogma of it's got to be chicken, broccoli, and rice for 4 meals of the day? Like, is that still how people are operating, or is this idea of flexible dieting becoming more, going more into that space?
It's made huge inroads, I would say. But I think the bodybuilding community, because it's such a niche sport, it is it's not a monolith. I think to an outsider, most niche things seem monolithic, like they seem like a unified culture. We could use CrossFit as another example. You know, there's people who don't like to use the word CrossFit because of the huge falling out recently with CrossFit, and this is functional fitness. And there are people who really don't like the idea of it being constantly varied to the point where it's like anti-periodization. You know, if you talk to like the people behind like OPEX, for example, and their training approaches, like CrossFit is actually quite varied in how it's approached. And there's like, it used to be the grid league and all this stuff. And I get a little exposure to that, and it reminds me like, oh, that's true of everything. And bodybuilding similar. So there's tested and untested bodybuilding. There's natural bodybuilding, and then there's bodybuilding where it is assumed at the highest levels that there's a lot of use of anabolics. And there's bodybuilding in many different countries. So I think some of the changes in the English speaking natural bodybuilding world have been really good. And I think they have been quite in step with research and science. I think I could play armchair anthropologist as to what's going on here. I think some of those changes haven't happened as quickly in non-English speaking countries because that just wasn't where that research was initially generated. And the largest research pool is English speaking journals. And in drug-free bodybuilding, I think it's a little more, it draws more people who don't have as extreme of personalities. Don't get me wrong, they're still bodybuilders, and they're looking to find ways to maximize their performance that doesn't include performance enhancing drugs. In the enhanced or untested side of bodybuilding, my experience has been that they're very much reliant on tradition. And to some degree, that is almost required, because it's not like you can look in the peer-reviewed literature to find out, what are the drug stacks that top level competitors are taking. So the armchair lab coats, that kind of attitude, no thanks. Like, what are the champs doing, and what are these underground coaches doing with pharmaceutical manipulation? So anyway, it can be a very different picture. So I think if you go to some of the certain countries where some of this information hasn't been reached yet, or if you go to ranks where it is dominated by mostly enhanced bodybuilding culture, then you probably won't see the commonness of this. But I've competed, and I've been to like World Natural Bodybuilding Federation, championships, and there is a majority of people, I would say, who are a lot more in line with what we're talking about and have less food restrictions. aren't drastically cutting water, and a lot of other things that I would say have been a positive outcome from a more research-oriented influence on the sport. So, quote unquote, flexible dieting has definitely penetrated that corner of bodybuilding. But this kind of goes back to the first question: is flexible dieting had a very strong life of its own, uninfluenced to some degree by that research line. And I don't know if your audience has heard of If It Fits Your Macros.
Yes.
Sure. So IIFYM grew out of science-interested promoters of fitness talking about this stuff. And it actually just started as an acronym back on the bodybuilding.com boards, where people got tired, like educated folks who were, well-known in our community, who would be answering questions, and they're very science-based. They weren't thinking of Westenhofer and colleagues, but someone would say, hey, can I have X, Y, or Z food? And the response was often, sure, if it fits your macros. Like, remember, again, folks, energy balance is what matters. It's not eating these magic foods that thin your skin or have these specific properties, which was, this was, I don't want to underestimate how much things have changed. So in the early 2000s, late 90s, all the way up to the mid 2000s, it was very rare to see someone in the kind of condition, and by that I mean leanness, on stage in the natural bodybuilding community, where they would have, say, in the male bodybuilding division, striated glutes, and just really have no appearance of subcutaneous body fat.
Yeah.
And that has changed, not just from participation, but there seems to be a lot more people who are competing in the peak condition. And now it is more competitive.
Yeah.
And I think that is because people have stopped ascribing certain foods as having these effects on the body, and more they're actually understanding elements like energy balance and preserving protein intake and having an appropriate rate of weight loss and some of these other things that are science-based. So that's a great outcome from If It Fits Your Macros, which is basically saying, hey, look, the biggest rocks, the biggest things, your foundational understanding of nutrition, you need to pay heed to energy balance. We need to understand the function of the macronutrients. And I think the arguments against it are, what about micronutrient quality? What about nutrient timing? What about all these other things? But again, when If It Fits Your Macros first popped up, it was within the bodybuilding community. It was layered on top of, not as in opposition to, that kind of traditional diet that was very regimented in terms of timing, already high protein, very micronutrient dense. It was comprised all of these whole foods. And it was basically saying, hey, that's great and all, but let's not just assume because we've cut out rice at this stage of our contest prep that we're in a sufficient deficit. And what does the deficit come from? What is energy balance? What are the function of the macronutrients? So If It Fits Your Macros was basically saying, hey, all that's great, but let's hit our targets. And that's what's going to dictate things. And when you need to make adjustments, you can cut from your carbs and fat, preserve your protein, and take these other approaches, or add cardio, whatever. And that became quote unquote flexible dieting because it was juxtaposed against these food lists. The traditional bodybuilding approach is you get to have all those foods I listed, which is still very few foods. And then somewhere about halfway through, you eliminate a lot of those carbohydrates. And at the end, you eliminate also all the fats. So the nuts come out, the butters, the avocados. And in the end, you're pretty much just eating lean meats and vegetables before you get on stage.
Yeah.
And that's a de facto creation of a linear reduction in calories, but it certainly leaves a lot of people not in the shape they need to be when you also couple that with diets that are too short and, overuse or underuse of cardio, et cetera, et cetera. So on the internet, If It Fits Your Macros became flexible dieting, and the research is still flexible restraint.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you and I, and maybe the listeners, can think of many times where simply weighing foods and hitting macros, but not having a restriction on what foods you can eat, doesn't line up with flexible restraint.
Yeah.
I mean, myself, I've chased down a grain of rice from the floor and put it back on the scale because I'm so hungry and starving that I can't have that happen. Or, cut off one little bit of stem of broccoli to make it weigh exactly 100 grams instead of 101.
Yeah. So with that in mind then, is flexible dieting in a more user-friendly way? Is it about looking at numbers, right? Calories, macronutrient grams and things like that? Is it a range that people would fall under rather than this is your particular target? So we've talked about it from a physique perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Do you use it with clients who you just generally work with out there who are just wanting to be fit and active and kind of live their best life?
Ironically, I think we talked about how many people look to physique competitors as, hey, that's a more extreme version of what I'm trying to achieve. I think a lot of some of the modeling of like the physiology of understanding how they got there, very important. But the processes and the methods, I think, can probably do more harm than good. So the average person who just wants to get fit maybe takes it very seriously. Their ostensible goal is to get into a good level of fitness, maybe if they have aesthetic goals, to look a certain way and maintain it, to live like that. The bodybuilder's goal is to get as lean as humanly possible or as appropriate for the division, which even in the softest divisions is still really lean, unsustainably lean.
Yeah.
And then gain weight back purposely to put muscle on in the off season. And if they know what they're doing, to gain body fat purposely, not just as an accidental side effect, because the state they're in when they get on stage is counterproductive to building muscle. They're not sleeping through the night. They're experiencing all the symptoms of REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport. Women are not having a menstrual cycle typically at that point. Libido's down in everybody. If you look at their testosterone levels in males, some case studies show it can drop to 1/4 of where they were in the off season. So the idea of building muscle in that state, let alone being like a healthier, happier, fit human, no, absolutely not. When you're in your best shape, you're probably in your lowest amount of health until you've, fed up into your show. Then it's like slightly better.
That's like no different from endurance athletes, really. When you're in peak condition and you are doing the type of training that allows you to perform at your optimal, that is not health either, right?
Absolutely.
Because of the type of training you're doing and everything else that's going on into it. Yeah.
Yeah, you've peaked, like stiffness if you're a runner, VO2 in all categories, but at the cost of other things. Same thing as physique sport. You have peaked your appearance at the cost of some other things. So they're purposely creating a cyclical diet. And the general population who is, if they're trying to get leaner, if they're trying to lose weight, if we look at that data, they are, due to frustration and inability to reach their goals, creating a cyclical diet. They don't want it to be there. They would love to lose the weight and maintain it. Yeah. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people regain weight. So I think it's really important to understand that the methods that physique competitors use to get in shape are and always have been intended to be a way to lose fat effectively, maintain maximal muscle mass, and then it's over.
Yeah.
So I don't like to use tracking macros and tracking calories. And this is a change in the last 5 years. Some of the ways I've changed my opinion. For me, I came from a background of eating a very rigid food list. So tracking macros felt like liberation.
Yeah.
And then, 5 years into tracking macros, even in the off season, I was like, what am I doing? This is a borderline eating disorder.
Yeah.
I can't just eat anymore. So when I got away from that, and that concurrently was happening as the intuitive eating, mindful eating kind of research started to come out. And when I started to realize that someone who has tracked macros like a bodybuilder or gone through a contest prep and has kind of a structured meal template, whether they're tracking or not, they don't need to be hitting these numbers. They have habits, which they should maintain as kind of their foundation, and then they can be modified as needed. And they absolutely, for a competitive bodybuilder, should maybe start tracking macros when hunger gets out of control and when those habits are victim to the drive of your body saying, I don't want to starve. Then you start, hitting a specific deficit, tracking weight loss and being much more quantitative. But for the general pop person, what I think the goal should be is to create behavior change, and then to try to get as much of the work done of a quote unquote diet without the person feeling like they're dieting. So when I first start to work with someone and they tell me, hey, my goal is to get bigger and leaner, if they're relatively new to lifting weights, that can happen without we don't need to push them into a huge surplus to gain weight. So mainly what I look at is qualitative changes. It's not about taking things away. It's about creating new structure and adding things. So let's get a serving of lean protein at every meal. Let's have maybe a meal schedule that includes like at least 3 whole meals, maybe 1 protein shake around training, or maybe 4 whole meals, and you can train between 2 of them. Let's get a serving of fruit and or vegetables at every meal. And let's get, a relatively, what we talked about earlier, mostly single ingredient food items. Let's get your activity levels up. Like if we look at what's the quote unquote obesogenic environment, it's a combination of a lot of factors. It's environmental, right? So it's external food cues like food commercials, the smell of food when you walk by it, societal pressure to eat. If you go out and buy food, you don't prepare it yourself. They give you a portion, and most people are going to eat at least 80% to 90% of the portion they're given because they bought it and they've been told societally, this is the appropriate amount to eat.
Yeah.
When you make a meal at home, you make the amount you think you will want to eat, and it tends to reduce portion size. We have a whole food industry that's based on customer enjoyment. We have food engineers who want your food to be hyper palatable.
Yeah.
If we go back 5 decades, something that tasted good is still satisfying. And what I mean by that is that the terminology you hear today, like you can't eat just one. Like
yes.
In the last 30 years.
They're telling us in their marketing exactly the behavior that they've paid millions of dollars to these food engineers to be able to create. Can't stop at one. Yep.
Yeah, sure. Crazy idea, folks. But when you eat food, it's supposed to make you more satisfied and satiated, and then you stop. Yeah. But now we have foods that you weren't that hungry. You're like, I could eat. You have one, and then you have a whole bag of chips.
Interesting, actually, Eric, just on that. I was watching a YouTube video last year. I can't have watched the entire thing because I probably would have gotten quite bored, but it was an eating competition, like the world eating competition for ice cream, I believe. And so I was watching this guy and he was, normal average build, because typically actually the people who do this, they're not at the size that you might expect them to be, He's eating, he's way in front, and then he stops and he's like, I don't know that I can eat anymore. And he's like, hang on, I'll have a serve of French fries, thanks. And he gets a serve of French fries and he's like, I'm literally so full. But he starts eating the French fries, and that cutting through that sweet flavor, and that actually enabled him to eat more ice cream, just because I think the contrast between the two, I found that super interesting.
It is, so a common trope you'll hear is that like sugar is addictive. And if sugar was truly addictive, you would find people buying sugar packets and eating sugar, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't have people who are addicted to heroin and they go, can I get some heroin cut with something else to reduce the potency?
Yeah.
They want that pharmaceutical grade, right? If anything has addictive-like properties, about as far as I would take it, and absolutely encourages overconsumption, is the right combination of flavors and the right amount of flavors to create that hyper-palatable experience. There was a cool metabolic ward study that Kevin Hall did where he found a group eating mostly ultra-processed foods and a group eating unprocessed foods, and they did everything they could to match the diets. It's quite difficult to match those types of diets because they typically have more sodium, more fat, more sugar, different energy density, which is also a part of it. So considering they tried to match it, so it's actually removing some of the ecological validity of how extreme processed foods can impact passive consumption. And people ate about 500 calories more ad libitum, even in a metabolic ward, and they ate the food faster. The thermic effect of food is lower, so the energy output when you're eating foods that are already processed, it's kind of basically been partially digested for you. How nice is that to think of it that way? It tastes amazing, and it encourages more consumption. So I think we have the food itself, we have a lower cost and a higher energy count, increasing portion sizes. So then how that food is delivered, what it costs, the availability of it. And then we also have a lower activity. As a bodybuilding coach in 1990, I would have had to have been in a major city in a Western world and working 8 hours a day in a gym. I'd have a step count over 10,000 easily every day being on the gym floor. Today, it means that I'm really good with Google Sheets, and I have an unlisted YouTube video that I make for all my clients, right?
Yeah.
So my step count, if I wasn't to do anything, like our full-time coaches at 3DMJ, most of their step counts, like I think Jeff was saying, he's around 3,000 to 4,000 a day.
Mate, you have to be so deliberate to get in your steps. That is not going to happen by accident. Yeah.
And so we think of that, if you're come from a quantitative researcher perspective of like energy balance, you think of, oh, that's a problem because you're not burning so many calories. But the real problem is how sedentariness affects appetite control. there's a really good study that was on Bengali mill workers. That's a classic study for anyone who's into physical activity. And they had the foreman who just sat there, and the managers basically. And then they were considered the low activity. And then they had moderate, high, and very high. And the body weights were identical at the group level in all the active factory workers, despite the fact that the energy expenditure was much higher and scaled linearly. So what they were doing is just simply increasing their caloric intake to match their energy needs and eating at roughly energy balance. But the managers, they had the highest body weight in the group and a similar consumption of energy to the very high group. So it's what's called the J-shaped curve of energy intake. And it shows that when you're physically inactive, when you're sedentary, it dysregulates your hunger and satiety. There's more latency and satiety signals. Hunger levels kind of just float a little more midline. So if you combine all these things that we're talking about, this food environment, the nature of food, its cost, its palatability, its energy density with lower activity, then we start to see why people will have homeostasis at a much higher body weight today than they would have in 1960.
Yeah.
So the goal when I'm working with someone who's general pop is to try to modify their environment and change their habits so they can remove themselves from that as much as possible, get their step count up, make them active, choose foods and cook their own foods, give them food skills really, and be able to, have a diet that largely consists of vegetables, lean meats, fruits, grains, rather than things that have been pre-prepared for them. Now, the challenge though, is that you have to, again, going back to that first line of research from Westenhofer, when you package that, when you give that information, you also don't want to demonize the existing food, and you don't want to pretend that they don't live in that environment. You're just doing your best to deal with it. Because we know if someone tries to completely eschew all of that, you're asking them to avoid a lot of food they might have grown up loving. You're asking them to have a difficult relationship with their family or their partner. You're making holidays something that they dread. You're creating a lot of potential pitfalls. So I think you have to teach them a little bit of both. Like, I do want you to have these non-quantitative. I don't want you to go to if it fits your macros. I want you to structure a lifestyle that would lead to a lower body weight or a leaner body weight that is auto-regulated without needing to count. But I don't want to say you can't have Frosted Flakes. I don't want to say you're not allowed to have X, Y, or Z, or if your friends want to go out to eat, you can't go with them, or that Christmas is now scary. So I also want to teach you what is the deal with energy balance, what is the caloric intake in these things, so you can kind of play that card when needed. Like I can, I understand how to do portion control. I can eyeball things. Like if I need to, if I'm in an environment where my auto-regulation would lead to overconsumption, if you're only there for a day, you go back to your normal diet, you'll just be less hungry the next day. Not a big deal. But to give someone tools when they do want to actually go through a purposeful fat loss phase, or to give them tools when they're going to be on vacation or something like that, I think you can have the best of both worlds. And that's normally where I operate from. And that process looks like teaching them about, reading food labels, tracking food, using MyFitnessPal, all that stuff, but not giving them targets. So I think the problem when you look at some of the research on like intuitive eating or the rates of MyFitnessPal usage in people with eating disorders and some of the issues I've ran into in the bodybuilding community is that people will replace their internal awareness of their satiety and hunger with an external cue like MyFitnessPal. So yes, the food environment is an external cue, but so is I'm going to hit these targets for protein, carbs, and fat no matter what. And that's a problem. So I want someone like you can, like, I think if you look at the amount that you track as an outcome rather than something that you're dictating. So my goal is to feel a certain amount of satiety or hunger. I want to be kind of in the middle of that scale, not too hungry, not too full. And I want to change my habits to eat these mostly quote unquote real foods. And I want to have a consistent schedule of eating. That's great. And I can also track MyFitnessPal and I find out how much I eat. So, that's interesting. I tend to eat between 23 to 2,600 calories and maintain my body weight. And it also serves as an audit. Like, I noticed my protein's a little low. Okay, I'll consume a higher serving of protein in each one of my meals, but then I'll still eat ad libitum my carb and fat sources. there can be that happy marriage where one informs the other. You're not a slave to your targets for fit your macros. You know what you're eating. And then when you do need to go through a phase of a purposeful caloric surplus, if you want to put on muscle mass, or deficit if you want to cut, then you can play a little more to the numbers and manipulate it more quantitatively.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And it's really, I find the whole macro counting thing really interesting because I've come from a background of never having done it myself, even in all my years of as a nutrition professional. Having said that, though, I think it was just ingrained in me that I had a knowledge of what was in food and the calorie counts for a lot of things. And I think you'll see this with a lot of nutritionists. And I don't know if you are similar to me, Eric. Coming from your bodybuilding, you might well be, in that there's a certain level of obsessiveness and restriction that is just naturally part of our personality that kind of lends itself well to what we end up kind of doing. So I think in part, and this isn't news to anyone that's listening to this, I'm sure, is, that's what kind of drives people into the nutrition space, is this interest / obsession around food and calories and things like that. So I think historically, we know as younger and experienced more problematic behaviors around that, probably led me down to a path of never really tracking, but always having a sense of what was kind of going in. In the last couple of months, recognizing and using tracking is the way that you describe it. Like, where am I at with regards to my protein, which I'm constantly telling people they need to eat more of? What is my protein intake like? Am I doing enough to support my energy output whilst training for the ultra? And it's been super useful from that perspective. It's allowed me to look at it and go, you might have spent 20 years in this industry, but hey, your protein's really low. You actually need to increase that and have a look at, when you're getting it in and things like that. So from a personal perspective, it's been actually almost liberating to track macros rather than restrictive, because then it has also made me go, I need to eat more. What am I going to eat? Rather than I'm only restricted to this amount of calories. How am I going to manipulate them to allow me for the most kind of satiety and things like that? I think that for endurance-based athletes, a lot of people are volume eaters, and a lot of women particularly are volume eaters. And so if you place a volume eater in an endurance sport, the outcome of that is likely that they will undereat, because where they're getting their volume from is fruit and vegetables, which are great, but they're not providing the nutrients and actually the calories that you need to kind of support it.
Yeah. And I think anytime you have a extreme goal, which I would absolutely classify in endurance, even the casual, like, I want to do a half marathon. Like, I think juxtaposing training for a half marathon to what you may have been doing before, like maybe a gym session once or twice a week, but more kind of general fitness, there's a big difference just in terms of the volume of work and the energy expenditure. And this is where you can see the divergence between nutrition and sports nutrition. The standard dietitian or nutritionist who is looking for public health outcomes and is trying to help people not find themselves just kind of slowly gaining weight over time because of the environment we live in. They are trying to get people to become volume eaters, and they want to get their fruit and vegetable intake up, make sure they're getting enough micronutrients, replacing a lot of quote unquote empty calories with things that are micronutrient dense, everything we've talked about. But as soon as you go to an extreme goal, like supporting sports performance, now all of a sudden, it is very challenging to have that as a habit set. Great habit set, don't get me wrong, but to actually meet the demands of your sport.
Yeah.
So, this is a funny thing. It happens for some, but not all in bodybuilding, because bodybuilding, we talk about how, weight regain happens.
Yes.
And anytime, like, the biggest predictor of someone gaining weight is whether they've dieted, So the pendulum swinging back, right? And dieting every off season, except for your first one, which precedes your first contest, just came after, or wasn't too long after. Maybe if you take an extended off season, this isn't the case. But like, if you're competing every other year, or you're competing every year, it's only months or at most maybe a year ago that you were starving. So you find it quite easy to eat a lot of food of any type in the off season. But if you're competing less frequently, or if you are someone who has really kind of got their head around the, doing bodybuilding in as healthy of a way as possible, then you're going to find a similar problem, like, so some people who are quote unquote hard gainers in the off season, they're trying to eat enough food. And if they have a really ingrained habit of eating in a healthy volume based way, they kind of have to use some of the tricks of the trade that's in not the trade, I should say, the environment that is out there. So now go eat a burrito, like, exactly, like have ice cream and then have something savory and then go back to ice cream, like you noticed in that YouTube documentary. Do things like eat fast, eat distracted, like our RD Steve Taylor on a recent 3DMJ podcast. Like when he has someone who's really struggling to gain weight, he tells them to, watch comedies while they're eating, because it's distracting and they'll look at the food and they won't even notice. So it's doing all the things that have led to us having a expanding waistline in the Western world, do that on purpose. So I think that's just really interesting. And, you were alluding to how the problematic behaviors around If It Fits Your Macros, they almost always come when If It Fits Your Macros is used for weight loss.
Yeah.
So when you're tracking for the purposes of, weight gain or sports performance, because you're not trying to create a deficit by hitting certain numbers, it becomes another metric versus this kind of thing you put on a pedestal. Like, I've got to hit these 3 numbers. That's my deficit. It's not working. What do I change? They take on a really special meaning and can very easily become vehicles for obsession when you're dieting using them. But tracking outside of the context of trying to diet, I think can be, like you said, a very useful metric for sport.
Now, Eric, I'm going to change tack a little bit based on kind of what I was sent me through, but I'm really interested because you competed a number of times last year, didn't you?
Yeah, 2019, I did a show in April, 2 in July, and 1 in August.
That is a long period of time to be prepping and competing in your sport. Like, how did you approach that with regards to your dieting side of things? Like, what were some of the key elements of, what we've just been discussing that you found really helpful, or maybe not helpful, with regards to that?
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you asked me that, because I'm the type of dude who, I'm kind of a late adopter of something until I get convinced. So, but I'm more so with myself than I am with my clients. So my clients, I would say that I'm much more willing to go out on a limb because I care about someone else's outcome. I'm willing to do it, but I need to really be convinced for myself. So it's this kind of weird inversion of conservatism with myself versus my clients. So anyway, I've been researching eating behavior and all this stuff we've been talking about for probably the last half decade. But interestingly enough, for the last half decade, I have been doing my PhD and my master's, and I haven't competed in physique sport. So my last season before 2019 was 2011, the year before I started my MPhil. And then I did my MPhil to my PhD. And then, I had a hip injury. And then I was like, all right, now I'm going to do a bodybuilding season and get back into it. So I had all this time of thinking differently about food and time to get convinced and time to actually implement that with clients. So I decided, I get to try this on myself. So for the first 2 months of my prep, through all of January, all of February, I didn't track at all. And I dropped solid 5 kilos off of just kind of going by feel, if you will, following my typical structure, not eating out, and really not having any additional carbohydrates or fats, I think is a good way to view it. So I had
protein intake for you when you were in that kind of January, February phase, those first couple of months. Would you have known what it was around roughly to help with your sport?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is it's hard for me not to know, even though I didn't know within 5 grams my macros, but I could probably have figured out my calories within maybe a 20-second period of thinking on any given day. And I probably could have told you without thinking at all with reasonable accuracy. So I was still consuming, I was consuming 4 meals a day and 1 protein shake. And each one of those meals a day was protein based. So like my last meal of the day was, a big Greek yogurt. That's like 40 or 50 right there. The protein shakes around 40. Breakfast and lunch would have been around 30 or 40 each. So definitely within a range that's appropriate for me. I compete around 80 kilograms and I'm shredded. Yeah, and then my caloric intake was where it was. It would go up and down. And I think that's the key point here, is that per my expenditure and my hunger levels, I would let my caloric intake fluctuate a bit. It didn't change a whole lot because my structure is pretty similar. But I would have another piece of fruit if I felt like I was, like, wow, I'm really hungry today. I'm only like 2 weeks into the diet. I shouldn't be starving. Oh, yeah, that's right. I was walking all over AET today or something like that.
Yeah.
So when I had those intuitions that I was hungrier, or I'd been really sedentary that day than needed, I would just up or down regulate my food intake. And it wasn't that I was trying to be, like I said, on a hunger scale of 1 to 10, trying to be in the 4 to 6 range.
Yeah.
I was trying to be like in the 3 to 5 range, accepting a certain level of hunger. So that got me down to really good condition. Something where I would have been comfortable for like a fitness model photo shoot, but not like get on stage, try to get a pro card in a competitive show type of deal. So around 8 weeks in, I think we're looking at beginning of March, end of February, I started tracking mostly to feel, to not have like a little nervousness in the back of my head. Like, let me make sure I'm crossing all my T's and dotting my I's, make sure I'm losing fat at a good rate, and also to give more information to Alberto, my colleague and often coach when I diet down, so that he knows where I'm at, and he can see me visually and then correlate that to what data I'm giving him. That did change some things. It would allow him to understand, well, you're looking really, really flat, like low in muscle glycogen. You look smaller than normal. I think we're going to have a refeed day. We're going to try to get that back up. I don't want you that flat at this stage, etc. So the first thing I incorporated was an actual approach of not tracking for the first couple months of prep. And then when I was about 2.5 months out from my first show, I started tracking. And then when I got into true like competitive stage condition, which was shortly after my first show was a bit of a warm up. I was in good shape. No one would have said like, wow, you're out of shape, Eric. They might have acknowledged that I could have gotten leaner, but I certainly was in acceptable stage condition. So sometime in May, I hit peak condition, if you will. And then we started walking my food back up. And the goal was to roughly maintain that condition. So I'm eating roughly around energy balance. So that period, then it got a little looser, but I was still roughly tracking. So I went from basically not tracking and eating by hunger and satiety and keeping it, a little more hungry than normal, to tracking and being pretty specific, to then loosely tracking, where it was just kind of like calories and protein and making sure I was eating enough and not taking it too far, because at a certain point, like, your hunger and satiety signals just tell you one thing, and that's eat more,
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of went across the full gamut, which was cool. And it was my most successful season to date, both in terms of my competitive outcomes and also how I compared to how I've looked previously.
Yeah, for sure. And I was listening to a couple of podcasts, unsurprisingly, and I think that you were talking about how low your calories got in some of those kind of real peak times in the lead up to your show. And then also, Eric, you talked about that idea of, just before I asked you that question, about this kind of insatiable hunger, because you've been on this calorie deficit for so long. Did you experience that insatiable hunger post-show? And like, how do you deal with that?
It was greatly reduced. Ironically, the worst insatiable hunger and the largest drive to gain weight that I could not control was my first season. And that was also when I got the least lean, because I didn't really know what I was doing. I mean, I got lean, don't get me wrong, but I've been a lot leaner.
Yeah.
And I put on 22 kilos in 2 months.
Whoa.
This time I put on 10 kilos in 2 months. And then it was a very slow rise. Now I'm still only like maybe 14 kilos over stage weight.
Yeah.
You're, over a year after my last competition, 14 months after my last competition. I've been hanging out here for, 6 months or something like that, if not longer. So the hunger is interesting. So there are multiple components to it. There is the way you feel just from getting leaner. There's also the way you feel from acute caloric deprivation. I went through the period where I got in great shape in May. That was me moving to getting into like really, really lean condition. And I was trying to get it done and dusted and then bring my calories up for the rest of the season. And there were on average like 1,400 calorie days, even including my high days, for a couple weeks. which is really low calories for someone who's 80 kilos.
Mm.
And I think it's easy to focus on the highs, or sorry, the lows, and forget the highs, because then only, 2 months later, my regular intake was 25 to 2,800 calories every day, with about 3,000 less steps per day, less cardio, more food.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hanging around 80 kilos from all the way from late May until August. So I had like 12 weeks at a much higher calorie intake after
Yeah.
that final push to get lean. And by far the worst I felt was when I was pushing to get really lean. Although it's interesting. So it's not just the food you eat. And so for a mini physiology lesson for people, leptin and ghrelin are kind of these two competing hormonal signals that we get in our body. Ghrelin being a hunger signal, leptin being a kind of master hormonal and metabolic controller that tells you you're fed. Eating food suppresses ghrelin, increases leptin, right? In general, there are some foods that are probably a little different, like we talked about earlier. However, leptin is also secreted by adipose tissue.
Yeah.
So that means that the only time you're going to have even decent leptin levels is like immediately during the meal and in the postprandial period. So one of the things I experienced, I was using what we call refeeds in the bodybuilding community throughout the diet until I got to that kind of maintenance steady state where basically all days are refeeds. So, I'd have, let's say semi early in my prep, I'd be having multiple days at say 1,800 calories. And then I'd have a handful of days, like 2 or 3 in a row at 24, 25, 2,600 calories, somewhere in there. And that's kind of what my diet would look like: replenish glycogen, replenish my psychological willpower, things like that. I noticed that when I was in good shape, but not shredded condition, by the second or third day of having a refeed, I would feel pretty much normal. If you could, drop my brain into the body of me in the off season or on that day, I wouldn't notice the difference. But if we're talking like July, even though I'm eating 2,700 calories every day, I still felt off. I was waking up in the middle of the night. My libido was totally absent. I would just feel in general a little bit lethargic, a little foggy in terms of my brain. And you don't fully recover when you're that lean. And that gives you an indication that there's probably some independency there. Like, it's not just, oh, if you eat enough, you'll be fine. It's not just energy availability. Like, if you look at the research on female athletes, especially, and when they start to experience hormonal disruption, most of it points towards, hey, it's about energy availability. Are you eating enough food for your current energy expenditure and work output? But they're not typically studying people who are uber lean and who have metabolically adapted downward to where maintenance is actually what would be considered below the threshold for, sufficient calories. You can be in a state of relative energy deficiency, but actually be maintaining body weight. And I think that's almost the definition of what occurs even when at maintenance in physique competitors.
Yeah.
So that feels different.
Yeah, for sure. And what you described there about that kind of metabolic adaptation was something that I was wanting to explore with you, just because that's something which 100% happens with endurance sport. You've described it personally yourself as you're actually eating pretty high calories compared to where you were at that 1,400, yet because your body fat was so low, that change in that hormone balance was still kind of lingering. So there was certainly, and the symptoms you describe as being the REDS kind of symptoms that we would see in that energy kind of deficit, yet your energy level was actually, or your calorie intake was actually, wasn't ridiculously low. Whereas for like people who might be endurance sport athletes, or actually I see this a lot just in general population of people who are following these legit 1,400 calorie diets, yet struggling to lose body fat. And in part, this is because they're trying to stay so low calorie that they only manage it for half of the week, and the other half of the week they might be at 3,400 calories because they just can no longer restrict. But in part, I think it is because their body has just adapted to such a low calorie intake. They're not actually in a deficit, even though the calories are as low, because of the changing in that energy cost of what they do day to day.
Yeah, I think I always try to help people to kind of merge the concepts of low energy availability and metabolic adaptation because they work in sync.
Yeah.
So we tend to talk about metabolic adaptation as just thinking about hand waving magic, and now you don't burn as many calories, right? And then we think, oh, low energy availability, you're not eating enough for your energy expenditure, and you experience these side effects that affect your hormonal, endocrine function, immune function, mood, injury risk, all this other stuff, even immunological, you name it, it affects pretty much everything. And they kind of live in these separate worlds. And probably because the researchers actually come from separate worlds, metabolic adaptation, they're primarily looking at, does a lower BMR and lower TDEE, total daily energy expenditure, does that predict or cause weight regain, or does it prevent weight loss? That's their own little world. That's a line of research. And then the low energy availability stuff like Luke's and all the folks over there, they're looking at reproductive function and health and athletes who are not necessarily dieting. So, and never the twain shall meet, right? But when you really think about what's going on, metabolic adaptation, well, how are we actually reducing our energy expenditure?
Yeah.
It's from shutting lights off in the building, right? So low energy availability describes the experiences and the outcomes of metabolic adaptation.
Yeah.
And I'll define that a little more clearly. So metabolic adaptation, there are small drops in BMR, basal metabolic rate, but there are large endocrine changes. We see reductions in thyroid, reductions in leptin, increases in ghrelin, tons of changes in appetite hormones that basically say you're not as satisfied, you need to be eating more. We also see large reductions in the NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So like you mentioned, there is actually increase in the efficiency of low intensity activities. So walking, cycling, daily chores start burning less calories than even be predicted by your body weight. Doesn't hold true for higher intensity activities, unfortunately, because that would really benefit athletes. But then you just wouldn't need as much food, but you do. So you burn less calories from becoming more sedentary and actually becoming more efficient. And it affects all this stuff. So I think if you just look at the caloric expenditure, you forget what is causing it. It doesn't just disappear. The actual experience is you're no longer producing like testosterone. You're no longer like producing sperm. You're no longer dropping eggs anymore. Like you're a amenorrheic. So the analogy I like to think of is, if you think of, actually it's quite appropriate given the recession we're in right now with COVID. If you think of a company that's trying to stay solid, to not actually collapse and go bankrupt, they've got a building, right? They've got an accounting department, they've got a human resources department, they got customer service, and they got the actual people doing whatever that business is. The first thing they do, we'll make a minor change. We're going to switch to low cost lighting, and we're going to put it on a motion sensor. So, the accounting department, they're just typing, nobody moves for a while, the lights go off, and someone has to wave their arm. So that's you noticing some of these effects, right? Then things get even leaner, and they fire half the accounting department. Right. So you're working more hours, a few more mistakes are being made, but there's not enough to pay for 4 full-time accountants. Next thing we know, human resources gets down to just one person. Patty's sitting there all by herself, just waiting for something bad in the company to happen so they have a job. So you feel this. That's the equivalent of this of Patty having a bad job experience, right? Now we're going to actually restrict time. So some people are going to be on furlough. We're going to actually, everyone's got to get out of the building at 5 because we're turning off the power. All this stuff doesn't go unnoticed. It keeps the company from going bankrupt, the equivalent of the athlete still being able to live. But you absolutely feel it. You notice the difference. Your job satisfaction goes down, right? So I think that is the experience of what is causing metabolic adaptation. These symptoms of low energy availability, your body conserving and turning off quote unquote non-essential function like reproduction, your interest in whoever you're attracted to normally, right? That all goes away so that you can survive. That's kind of your body's perspective. And that results in a reduction in calories. And that's how it works. So I think that's why you can have someone who is at energy balance, but with all these adaptations present. The reason why they're at balance is because half the lights are off.
Yeah.
So when people get low energy availability, or I should say, when they get low energy availability and energy balance confused, they get a little like, how could I be having symptoms of low energy availability? I'm maintaining weight, so I'm not in a deficit.
Yeah.
Well, the reason why you're not in a deficit is because your body's shut down half the lights.
Yeah.
So it really does come down to getting above certain, what are viewed as thresholds, if you look at some of the math behind it, of intakes. So the way we actually, quote unquote, calculate energy availability is you take kilograms of lean mass, and then you take the amount of exercise activity you're doing, and you subtract that from your energy intake, and if that's above, say, like 30 kcals per kilogram of lean mass, that's considered enough for most female athletes. And that's going to obviously vary from person to person.
Yeah.
What counts as exercise or regular activity? It's imperfect, but it's a decent metric. If you're someone who's dieted down to a certain amount of lean mass, and in that process you've experienced metabolic adaptation and by proxy low energy availability, and then you bump up your food to maintenance, it'll probably still be below that 30 kcal threshold.
Yeah.
And if you were to get above, you would start gaining weight, and then eventually your weight would settle, and you would be at a sufficient energy intake, and that is when you stop experiencing those symptoms. So some people, simply put, want to be leaner than is realistic or healthy or sustainable.
Yeah. And Eric, I imagine you must see this a little bit with what you do, because of course you do work with in that physique space. When you kind of come across, or you're talking to a client about this, energy adaptation or metabolic adaptation, what is your process for getting them out of it? And indeed, you talked about how you were able to maintain the same body weight, yet bump your calories up to be almost double what they were on your lowest of low days. How do you go about that process, and what are some of the expectations around it?
Yeah. So if you are really, really, really lean and you're bringing yourself out of a deficit and an energy balance, you are going to see an uptick of energy expenditure. So the math doesn't add up if you think of it as a static system. For example, I was losing maybe a little over a half a kilo a week eating 1,400 calories. So that would predict my maintenance at 1,900. So how the heck did I get all the way up to 28? Math doesn't make sense. You didn't track right. That's the internet's answer. The reality is that we're seeing both ends of energy adaptation, right? So we're seeing me minimally adapted for one way and maximally adapted, or not maximally, but rebounding the other way. We know from overfeeding studies that metabolic adaptation can go the other way, trying to gain weight at a rapid pace or beyond what someone's homeostatic body mass is. They will defend that. Not everyone. Called a spendthrift or thrifty metabolism, but it goes both ways to some degree. We're much more successful at defending body weight loss for evolutionary reasons. But the experience that most people have when they get really lean for competition, they start to feed up, is that you get much more than you'd expect out of going upward. So some of the really gnarly levels of lights being turned off goes away. Some of the, Patty's no longer working alone, the lights go back on, but they don't get all the way back until you actually gain back a reasonable amount of body fat. So the experience for someone who's lean, a competitor, what I experienced was being able to increase my calories more than 1,000 per day on average, despite the fact that you would, by the math, think I could only go up 500. Some of that's purely just the thermic effect of food. It takes about 10% of the energy we eat to actually process the energy we eat. So if I increase my calories by 1,000, I really only see a 900 calorie increase in terms of energy utilization, right? So anyway, and then the rest of it is what would be described as true metabolic adaptation the other way. This does happen, but to a less extreme degree, because you're not as tanked. If you're someone who dieted to a place where you're happy with your physique, like you're at a sustainable body fat, and then you go up, you'll see a small bump upward. If you were, let's say, we'll use myself as an example. Let's say I just wanted to maintain 89 kilos, which is a pretty lean state for me. That's about 6 kilos down from where I'm at now. And I'm certainly not over fat at the moment. If I wanted to walk around in kind of like good off-season condition, then, like attending a wedding condition, we'll call it that. If I wanted to walk around like that, I wouldn't expect to be able to increase my calories by 1,000 from dieting. It'd probably be more like 600, 700. Get a little more punch for than I'd expect, right? So I think you can expect that, but you don't exactly know what the magnitude is going to be. So what I typically recommend people do is they just eliminate the mathematical deficit, based on weight loss, and then start nudging it up. And when you actually start to see your weight gain start to come up more predictably, then you taper back down or just hold off there. and then you just hang out,
Yeah.
and you'll get for a while feeling better and better and better. And then if you're still hungry and you find your food focus is there and you're not sleeping well, you're probably trying to sustain something that's unsustainable.
Yeah.
And the beauty of some of these subjective symptoms, and that if we understand that low energy availability and metabolic adaptation are two sides of the same coin, that means we can use the subjective experience of low energy availability, some of these, poor sleep, hunger, and a lack of satiety, that can tell you when you're trying to maintain too lean.
Yeah.
During a diet, it just tells you that you're dieting,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
but after the diet, if you are trying to get to a place of maintenance and you're still experiencing even like lightweight versions of what you experienced during dieting multiple months after it's over, you may be either taking an approach that isn't very balanced with your nutrition, or needs to be sorted a little bit, or just as equally potentially likely is that you are just trying to stay too lean. And absolutely something I run into, especially in the newer divisions in physique sport, like men's fitness, men's physique, and bikini,
Mm-hmm.
where you don't have to get quite as lean, you don't have to be really, really muscular, and it is almost kind of like walking around in almost a sustainable condition is what people try to do in the off season. So the diets can be shorter. I think there's also some sociology in play there. People who
Mm.
typically, and this is just me, armchair sociologist, I don't have any data to back this, but people who compete in men's physique and bikini are a little more interested in the beauty aspects of it, the more pageant aspects. There is no normal part of society that says being huge, ripped, shredded, and veiny with lines in your butt is attractive.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but looking good in board shorts or a bikini,
Mm.
absolutely. That's something
Yeah.
like the vast majority of the goals people get when they work with a personal trainer is they want to look good in their birthday suit.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is certainly people who maybe can't divorce their sense of self-worth or their body image from their competitive physique to the same degree. Bodybuilders who are successful, and I do mean in the bodybuilding division, they're pretty good at not caring too much what they look like in the off season, or being happy with their off season body,
Yeah.
because they see attaining this freaky physique, to use probably the appropriate word, as something that is akin to running faster or throwing a football or baseball or some kind of extreme athletic feat.
Absolutely. That's kind of like what you wouldn't continue to go and do your 4 hour runs if you've got no training, no like ultra coming up that you're actually training for. Same thing.
Absolutely, yeah. You would stay in the condition that came from the amount of endurance training you like to do, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
a nice base to kind of start from. And while Eric, we're talking about you and your physique kind of experience, I think what those the symptoms that you're talking about that people can kind of look to is as to whether or not their diet is sustainable or what they're trying to achieve from their diet is sustainable is absolutely across the board. This isn't just the domain of someone wanting to compete in physique. This is if you are out there and you are, you've got some body composition goals, regardless of your sport, or even if you're in a sport or you just like to keep fit. If you are trying to sustain like a diet that results in inability to sleep, hangriness, low blood markers of like iron and zinc, because of course with more food comes micronutrients, and then those are the things which you kind of want to explore and kind of have that honest kind of discussion with yourself, I suppose, as to is this unsustainable. And that whole thing you mentioned about self-worth being tied up into a body kind of image, or a weight on the scale. I see it all the time. And almost I feel like some people disassociate some of those subjective markers with what they see on the scale. Like I'll have a client catch up and I'll be like, first tell me, how are you feeling? How's it going? And they're like, my energy's great. I feel really good. My clothes are fitting well. But I'm so disappointed because the scale only registers like, 1 kilo down for the month, or I'm staying the same weight. So there's this real disconnect between the worth of different metrics as well, I think.
Absolutely, and it's very obvious when you get into the extremes of it, where especially with people are influenced by things like Instagram. One of the things where while I do understand that people look up to bodybuilders, I think seeing a lot of images and people in bodybuilding condition as becoming the norm, getting
Mm.
exposed to that regularly, I think can really increase that disconnect.
Mm.
So the conversations I end up having with a lot of my competitors who struggle with trying to stay too lean is exactly around that. Like I was on a podcast, or actually I was on an Instagram live recently, and I mentioned the process of gaining weight purposely post competition, and how and the person I was with commented on how that must be hard for people when they're just in the best shape of their life. And I said, and that's exactly the perspective I push back against when the client views it that way. You're
Mm.
not in the best shape of your life. You're in the
Mm.
best shape for your sport right now, but
Mm-hmm.
for life, you're in terrible shape. And then I ask the person to think about their values. What do they believe? If they
Mm.
have kids, what do they want to model for their children? What do they think society should be telling people? And I try to create that dissonance to where they can see that their own behaviors don't line up with who they want to be and how they wish the world was.
Mm.
So if you can only appreciate your body or like the way you look when you're in this level of leanness that is objectively less healthy than you having a higher level of body fat, that requires you to white knuckle your relationship with food and stay active to the point where you're not actually enjoying it anymore. When
Mm.
the whole reason you got into lifting weights because you love it, and now you're clocking after every session 30 minutes of walking on the treadmill and not enjoying it. Is that really the shape of your life? Are you
Yeah.
living your best life? Do you like this? And then, okay, so what is influencing that decision? You believe to have self-worth or value or to be accepted or loved, you have to look a certain way or weigh a certain amount. And I think most people, when they can recognize that, they go, that's not what I believe. That's not who I want to be. That's not what I want to be a victim to. And I think that that's the starting point to a long
Mm.
process of enjoying, or I should say appreciating their body when it's fully functioning, and finding acceptance and eventually enjoyment and liking what they look like in the off season, and seeing that represents all the things they do care about. If they can connect their off season physique to their values, like, oh, that's when I'm strong. That's when I
Yeah.
feel good. That's when I have a
Mm.
great relationship. I'm present with my family instead of thinking about my next meal. Yeah, it's great to be in shape because that's when I succeed and I love my sport. But it's kind of like Icarus. Like I'm going to go to the sun sometimes, but I don't want to burn up and crash to the earth. And I think that helps people understand why I recommend not competing every year. That's why
Mm.
I recommend people purposely gaining body fat as soon as they're done with their last show for the season,
Mm.
and not trying to stay lean, and not really basing their identity around being a bodybuilder, but appreciating that I can be a bodybuilder. I'm really good at that, and I get a lot of meaning out of that. However, if I try to be a bodybuilder to the exclusivity of the rest of my life collapses and I can no longer bodybuild.
Yeah, totally. And I really like how it's focusing more on what the body can do rather than what the body looks like, right? Because when you are in off season, or you're not particularly, or you're kind of gearing up to your next event, and you might be a couple of kilos over your kind of race weight, for example, that is when you are strong and you've got that muscle and you've got the fuel required to do the workout, and you can really appreciate what your body can do in that instance. And I often talk about this with clients, like, because running and endurance sport is so intricately tied to body weight, there's a lot of negative connotations around being a runner for that reason, or running as a sport. But I would like to see it kind of tipped on its head in that using food as a fuel to support your best performance. And your best performance isn't about what you weigh on the scale. It's about what you can kind of achieve in your sessions and hitting those metrics. So there are so many parallels I see between who you work with in your sport and who I work with in my sport, but then also that middle ground of just the people we see in everyday life, just trying to reach their goals with body composition, but actually just be a healthy, happy human.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's one of those things that's very, when you're in the midst of it, it's very difficult to see it.
Yeah.
You often, it's unfortunate that by the time your partner or your family points it out, you've probably gone pretty far astray of how you'd like to be if you could, float above the world and look down at your behavior and the way you're being. So that's, I think, one of my roles as a coach. I can't have the realization for my clients. We can't do that. Even if we could, it wouldn't be effective. That's the quote unquote secret of therapy is, the therapist helps you have these realizations, and that's what true behavior change and new views of self come from. So I think pointing out that dissonance, like you just said, you said this about how you feel, then you said how you felt after you weighed. Those don't match. What do you think about that? That's how you do it. And I kind of pointing out each time, like when they say I'm in the best shape of my life, like, well, are you though? And having them think about that, it helps kind of break that cycle. It's an important thing. And anyone who works with any sport that asks people to manipulate the way they look or what they weigh, or it's a large part of the culture of the sport, I think it's really important for you to be aware of just how much stress and potential for harm there is, even though there's a great potential for positives. And it's good to have some connections in your professional network with someone who is a clinical nutritionist and who or someone else who is also experienced with eating psychology or eating disorders. If there's like one thing, if someone's listening to this, like, oh my God, I didn't realize there's all this potential harm, have those people in your professional network, having an eating disorder specialist, have a therapist, have a someone who is, a clinical nutritionist or dietitian who understands these things and can help people so that you're not trying to do things that you aren't trained for or don't have the experience or the scope to address.
For sure. And if I just circle back to something you said just to finish up on with the intuitive eating piece, like it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, did that take practice for you, Eric, the trust in just doing it without the tracking? How did that, how long did it take for you to feel like you were really confident, even within that January, February? Because I know obviously as you got more towards your competition, you were much more structured around it. But were you nervous about doing it initially, or what was your kind of experience with it?
I had a few testing rounds. So in 2012, when I moved to New Zealand from the States, I had been tracking on MyFitnessPal. I had a ridiculous streak. I think it was like over 1,000 days, but with just a few gaps of when a holiday would happen, I had been tracking for 5 years. So food scale when I was at home, eyeballing when I went out to eat, trying to hit targets, knowing where I was at for 5 years. And when I moved to New Zealand, I was like, look, they're not going to have the same foods. I'm not planning on getting on a bodybuilding stage for the entirety of my master's and PhD. Why am I doing this? And it does create, like, I was really good at it. I knew how to do it. And I think I had minimized the amount of stress that I could minimize. But like I had an unplanned event come up, it would still cause like eensy bits of resentment that I'd be like, that's ridiculous. I shouldn't be feeling that, So I stopped tracking in near the end of 2012 when I came to New Zealand. I realized like I can't not know what I'm eating now. I have a general idea of my protein intake, my calorie intake. And I also got to develop an awareness of my satiety and hunger. And for the first time, probably started to rely on them again. And it was an interesting pattern. I had an initial small amount of weight gain when I first came to New Zealand, maybe a couple kilos. And the next thing I knew, I think I had one of my powerlifting competitions where I was competing in the 93s. I weighed in at like 89.2.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, like I probably need to eat more. Like my that was, I think 2015 or 2014. So after a couple of years, I had trended all the way down from 94, 95 down to like 89, 90 at kind of my just weight stable, not worrying about it, eating normally after kind of relearning how to eat, but still following some of the patterns. I think just my portion sizes had gone down. So that was very interesting. And then in 2018, actually 2017 and 2018, I purposely got up to 100 kilos. And it took me a while. It took me about 16 months, I think. And then I was like trying to get as big as possible. I was doing less powerlifting focused training, a lot more bodybuilding because I knew I was going to compete in 2019. So I wanted to have a really successful off season before I jumped into competing. But I also didn't want to start my prep at 100 kilos. I wanted to start it closer to 90. So in April of 2018 and then in October of 2018, I did 2 brief cuts and I did them without tracking. I just basically stopped eating out and changed my food behavior so that it was lead to habitually lower calorie intake. And I dropped like 4 kilos both times without effort. So I had done it for mini cuts. I had been living that way for a while. And I was like, oh, I can just repeat what I did for those mini cuts and basically until it stops working or I get hungry and then start doing tracking macros again. And I think that's basically what happened. I think there was also the piece that I didn't anticipate, that I'm nervous about not being optimal here. Like the closer I got to competition, the more the psychotic internal bodybuilder who wants to to win, took over a little bit. I was like, look, let's track. And I was like, fine, at the very least, it'll be a safety blanket for me. So yeah, I think that it is something, whether you come from a sporting background or whether you come from being in the general population in the Western world, you're exposed to external cues that can supplant your normal intuition. And that's why, like, mindful eating is not the control group. Intuitive eating isn't the control group when you look at these studies. It's an intervention. You have dietitians who are trained in these practices, typically, who teach that group through multiple counseling sessions how to do this, how to get in tune with satiety, how to get in tune with their hunger, teach them the 10 principles of intuitive eating, which is an actual practice in dietetics, or teach them how to be mindful, show them how to eat in a non-distracted way, how to think, how to take time. And that ends up being an intervention that typically results in, weight neutral for intuitive eating. And some of the mindful eating has actually been used as weight loss interventions without instructing a calorie deficit necessarily, but giving them some guidance along with mindful eating, and actually results in weight loss. So to answer your question more directly, I had a lot of years to use this in much less risky and time sensitive ways, including both gaining weight and losing weight. So I think for someone who is interested in maybe trying something that they would traditionally use if it fit your macros for, I would say try going with a more quote unquote intuitive approach on something that has less cost or less risk, or doesn't scare you emotionally first, like just day-to-day life. And see how it goes.
And I think as well, just to add a couple of thoughts on that, is that if someone isn't experienced in intuitive eating, I guess a lot of the pushback about intuitive eating is that it's very difficult to be intuitive when you're in an environment that has these hyperpalatable foods, because you are losing touch with what is real hunger, what is blood sugar response, what is energy crash, things like that. So I love the idea of intuitive eating, but I also like to kind of couch that kind of mindfulness in and around, making sure you're hitting protein, making sure that you've got good, and this comes back to the volume, because I'm talking to people about intuitive eating in the context of weight loss most of the time, actually. So getting in the foods which we know are going to provide more satiety, yet being mindful about how you feel when you eat, so you're not governed by those other foods which are just going to make you hungry, even make you hungrier when you eat them rather than satisfy you. So I suppose people like us with intuitive eating, who have had a number of years of personal experience and also have pretty good diets, so we're kind of a bit more protected, if you like, from the hyperpalatable kind of food environment. I think for other people, having a couple of cues around protein and fiber and stuff can be really helpful too.
No, I totally agree. There's a paper I recently wrote with Jake Lenardin and Katerina Pernjak called "Toward the New Paradigm of Nutrition and Physique Sport." And I always butcher the name. It's something very similar to that. I didn't want to call it intuitive eating outright, because for those who aren't familiar, intuitive eating, like TM, is a framework that's weight neutral. Evelyn Tribole, registered dietitian, created it along with her partner, who's her name is escaping me at the moment. But they created this 10 principles, and it is something that you absolutely train people. And kind of in our space, you and I, Mikki, like our extended space, we think of hey, if you've tracked and if you've got these nutrition habits, and you're good to go for it. But I think you also need training if you haven't had those, just to understand intuitive eating, because both of those are different types of external cues, like hitting macros on MyFitnessPal, or being, largely controlled or heavily influenced, I should say, probably more accurately, by the, hedonistic and obesogenic food environment we live in. In either case, though, you need to be taught these principles, and that is a weight neutral approach. So I think when people fully buy into and use intuitive eating TM, they have to get to that point where they go right now is not the time for me to try to lose weight. These principles are for me to recalibrate and get back to quote unquote normal.
Yeah, nice.
And, if I'm not, experiencing PTSD from all the previous failed attempts at weight loss and all the other diet experiences I've had that led me to this place where I need to not try to lose weight to get back on point, and weight loss might be beneficial or something I care about in the future, great, I can cross that bridge when I get there. So anyway, in our paper, The Paradigm of Nutrition and Physique Sport, I describe it like a modified intuitive eating approach with sport supportive behaviors. So instead of
Mm.
here's your grams per kg of protein and carbohydrates, like you can go read those papers. I've written those too, but that's more kind of understanding the theoretical and physiological needs. But for actually what do I do? I think it should be more qualitative. It should be behavioral and finding the combination of food choices and environmental changes that result in an appropriate autoregulation, like eating more energy dense foods when you need to gain weight, eating less energy dense foods when you want to maintain or have like a shortcut, and then actually moving towards something that's not intuitive and is tracking and more regimented and controlled when you need to lose substantial weight past the point that is sustainable. Those kind of can exist in a cohesive framework, which we proposed. So I totally agree. I think it's a really important skill for anyone to learn, just to understand basic nutritional competence. Like what is food labels, like what is carbs, what is calories, what is fat, what are some of these big picture understandings, what foods for me personally make me feel full, satiated, satisfied, and how can I create a lifestyle around that? And then what are my triggers? What things in the obesogenic environment am I most likely to get triggered by or affected by, et cetera? And then that is what might look like. So if someone does want to take an intuitive approach to weight loss, exactly what you described is I think first port of call, instead of like going right BMR equation, activity, multiplier, and then we cut 600 calories based on we want to lose 0.5% of your body weight per week and go.
Yeah.
Instead, it's like, hey, let's try to change your habits and your environment and your day-to-day life and your perspectives. And you know what? If you lose weight, great, but let's focus on the process, and it probably will result in weight loss, but it also gives so many more wins.
Yeah.
Like if eating a vegetable or fruit with every meal and having a serving of protein and having a stable meal structure, hitting a step count, exercising, meditating, getting 8 hours of sleep, if that's like 7 things, and I'm not even near all the things we might actually counsel someone to do, where you can have a win that day, you can get that equivalent of the like button, or those little Facebook games that distract you from work, where you're like planting stuff or raising animals or escaping and getting the treasure, like all the way video games work, like those little endorphin wins and achievements unlocked. You have a ton of those every day. But if it's just the scale, man, you can have a bad day even when everything's going right, just because water weight wasn't your friend.
100%. Yeah. And I think as well that a lot of people think that they want to know the calories and they think that they want to track macros, but they don't realize, like, people think about food. People don't think in macros, so it's so much easier and so much easier for the person if they're just thinking about food rather than, am I hitting this number of calories and this amount of protein and things like that. And if anyone in New Zealand is interested in intuitive eating, I'm pretty sure that my friend down in Christchurch, Sarah Lake, she's actually just completed her course in intuitive eating. And I know there will be many practitioners around, but she's a nutritionist and this is something that she's really interested in as well. And you're so right, Eric. It's like within itself, it's a practice or a skill to kind of learn. And the more you understand it and learn from people who actually understand it themselves, probably the better someone will be able to approach it and do it successfully rather than kind of be let down by other things around them maybe too.
No, it's very well said. I totally agree.
Eric, I've taken up a ridiculous amount of your time. And this conversation went as I totally predicted in my head, nowhere where I thought it would. I mean, we covered actually a lot of what I thought, but it was such a rich conversation in your experience in that physique, your own experience and what you kind of witness with your kind of clients, which is, really practical, even for people obviously not in that physique space. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'm going to Google search and find those studies that you talked about with regards to rigid restraint, with your papers on the nutrition paradigm, with that Kevin Hall paper as well, and hopefully anything else which I have missed out. Where can people find you on the interwebs?
Absolutely. You can find me at 3dmusclejourney.com. That's the number 3, the letter D, then musclejourney.com. From there, you can find links to my books on nutrition and training, monthly applications in strength sport, which is a monthly research review on stuff in this kind of realm, with myself and Dr. Zerdos, Dr. Trexler, and Greg Knuckles. And you can also find links to our 3DMJ podcast, which I mentioned, or blogs that we do. For more daily content, I'm pretty active on Instagram. You can follow me at Helms3DMJ. And if you love podcasts, like I said, there's a 3DMJ one, but I also, myself and Omar Isuf, we have Iron Culture, which kind of explores very holistically the whole iron game in all facets from history, science, and culture.
I love it. And I always learn so much when I go and listen to your podcast, and not just about strength and conditioning, a whole host of things, which, I really appreciate just as a lifelong learner. It's awesome.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it means a lot to me, Mikki, especially coming from you.
Great. Lovely. So team, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did chatting to Eric, and unsurprisingly I could chat to him all day, really. So interesting. He is not hard to find on the internet if you want to track him down, and he's always really open to taking queries and things like that. You can find him on Instagram at Helms3DMJ. He is also the co-founder of the Mass Science Monthly Journal, which is a monthly research review in the strength, conditioning, nutrition field, which is great. I subscribe to that. Eric also has his own podcast, as you would have heard us talk about, Iron Culture, which again I find super interesting and pretty bloody funny actually a lot of the time. So that's Eric Helms for you. And next week, which is in almost the new year, we have Professor Frederick Leroy, who is my go-to for anything related to red meat, environment and health. And just on the back of the Heart Foundation statement in and around what we should do with our red meat intake, I thought I would reach out and just touch base with Professor Leroy and just get his take on, where red meat should sit in a healthy diet. So I hope you really enjoy that. Until then, you can find me at Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, or over on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, or jump on to my website, mikkiwilliden.com, and if you're interested in trying to do a little bit different or a little bit better with your food intake, sign up to one of my meal plans. We've got a real food nutrition plan, I have a monthly weight loss plan, I've got a ketogenic longevity plan, and also an athlete plan, which provides meal plans, weekly emails and blogs, a weekly forum, and also hundreds of recipes and access to ask me individual questions through our online nutrition platform. And that's actually a really great way to support the podcast as well, because I know some of you have been asking me about that. And if you enjoy the podcast, please head over to your favorite podcast platform and leave us a 5-star review, because that just means that more people will be aware of Mikkipedia, and it'll just help kind of spread the word. We'd really appreciate that. So until next week, have a great rest of your week. Merry Christmas, and look forward to seeing you next week.